Zelda II: The Adventure of Link is a very mysterious game, often criticized as being the worst Zelda game ever made by Nintendo, or even just a bad game in general. And yet, it was a title that conquered the video game world when it was released, with glowing reviews from journalists, excellent sales, and above all, a significant influence on later games in the series, and even on other games of its time. Many people are confused and don't quite know what to make of this game, simply because it's so different from the rest of the Zelda titles that it's often misunderstood. Experience points, leveling up, side-scrolling combat, bizarre NPC dialogue, Zelda II is a game that can surprise in both good and bad ways because of how strange it is. And that strangeness comes from an unusual development process during a time when Nintendo was experimenting and trying out new ideas. Today we're going to look back at the story of the most hated Zelda game, the one even its own creator, Shigeru Miyamoto, admits to disliking, calling it the game he regrets the most, despite its critical and commercial success. It's early 1986. The Legend of Zelda is released in Japan on the Famicom Disk System, and it's a great success, even though the accessory itself doesn't sell particularly well, making the game less accessible. It surpasses 1 million units sold, which is rare at the time, especially for a title released on a brand new console add-on. But beyond the sales, what really stands out is the game's critical acclaim. It receives excellent reviews and quickly builds a stellar reputation thanks to its many strengths, most notably a unique and surprising gameplay experience, which I covered in detail in a previous video. But 1986 is also the year where Super Mario Bros. Impact can be seen, with a great wave of games adopting a similar jumping mechanic. Platformers become incredibly popular, titles like Adventure Island, and especially the rise of side-scrolling action-adventure games such as Ghosts and Goblins, Ganbare Goemon, Dragon Ball, and Castlevania. These games draw inspiration from Super Mario Bros. And its jump system, but they take it in a different direction, one that focuses more on combat and how enemies are defeated. That doesn't necessarily make them more advanced than Super Mario Bros., but rather different, part of a new trend emerging on the console. But all of this happens just a few weeks, or at most a few months, after the release of The Legend of Zelda. And at that time, Shigeru Miyamoto, the game's director and producer, felt that the combat in the first Zelda was a bit repetitive. Even though players could use different items, he would have liked to make the fights deeper and more varied. And even if no one else really noticed this repetitiveness, Miyamoto wanted to try something different, to see if it was possible to create combat that felt more dynamic and diverse. So he gathered a team of developers and gave them a mission: create a side-scrolling combat system with multiple ways to attack and defend, something deeper than what the first Zelda offered. The problem, though, was that the original Zelda team was already busy working on the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2, and what would eventually become Super Mario Bros. 3, a massive project that would keep them occupied for a long time. And other development teams were also tied up with their own projects, one of them being a game called Metroid. They left Miyamoto with no choice but to turn to younger, less experienced developers, especially ones who hadn't worked on the original Zelda, which was pretty unusual for Nintendo at the time. He picked Tadashi Sugiyama to lead the project, mainly because he had worked on Ice Climber, a side-scrolling action platform. He paired him with Yasuhisa Yamamura, who had worked on several Famicom sports titles, also action-oriented games. And fairly quickly, the team came up with a combat system that Miyamoto liked. The project was officially greenlit, and more developers were brought on board, but again, mostly young talent who had only worked on 1 or 2 games at most. When it came to the soundtrack, there was a big question. The music for the first Zelda was composed by Koji Kondo, and it had wowed both players and critics. But Kondo was now busy working on Super Mario Bros. 3, with a massive soundtrack to compose. So Akito Nakasuka was brought in to score the game. He was known for his work on Excitebike and Ice Climber. The project was unusual in many ways. At no point did Shigeru Miyamoto talk about it as a direct sequel to the first Zelda. It was developed more like a spin-off than a true follow-up. As a result, the development team took some liberties compared to the original. It started with Link's design. He was taller, with longer arms and legs, a slimmer build, a brand new look designed to fit the side view gameplay. Because Link would be shown from the side during battles, he needed longer limbs to animate properly. But this side view perspective brought a problem. It didn't allow for the kind of exploration that was the heart of the original game. And even if the game was more of a spin-off than a sequel, it would be a shame to lose the exploration element that had been so brilliantly implemented and so well received in the first Zelda game. That's what led the team to make a very intriguing decision. They kept the top-down view for exploration and switched to side view for battles and dialogue. It was a bold and original compromise, one that generated a lot of curiosity within the company. Just after development began on May 27, 1986, a game was released that would shake Japan like very few before it. That game was Dragon Quest. It launched just a few months after The Legend of Zelda, and it was an absolute phenomenon, an incredible tidal wave. It became a full-blown cultural event in Japan, selling over 1 million copies in less than 6 months, which was massive for the time. So massive, in fact, that it ended up right alongside Super Mario Bros. On the list of best-selling games of the year. And on top of that, it was named Game of the Year by Famitsu, earning titles like Best Storyline, Best Character Design, and Best RPG. Dragon Quest suddenly introduced the Japanese public to RPGs, a genre that until then had been very niche. What was seen as revolutionary at the time were Dragon Quest mechanics, following a storyline, getting to know characters and watching them grow stronger over time, having stats, gaining experience points, and so on. And if you remember, these are ideas that were also present, though in a different form, in the first Zelda. No direct experience points, but progression through item collection and guiding the player step by step. So the development team found themselves a bit lost. Should they follow the path set by Dragon Quest, which had just exploded in popularity across Japan, or should they stay true to the original Zelda, a game that was universally praised but came out earlier? It was a bit of a dilemma because the two approaches couldn't fully coexist. For example, if you chose to follow a group of characters instead of a single protagonist, you gain more depth in the story and allow for more variety of combat styles. But you also lose some of the immersion and the strong sense of isolation that made the first Zelda so unique. On top of that, Miyamoto himself thought Dragon Quest was an excellent game, with very clever mechanics. He had a great deal of respect for it. So he encouraged the developers to draw inspiration from it, and they made some bold choices. First, they had already decided to stick with just one character, Link, and they weren't going to change that. But they did decide to incorporate RPG mechanics, stats like health, magic, and attack power, all tied to the player's level. They also added experience points, which were meant to encourage players to engage more with the game's combat system and fight monsters frequently. This experience point system didn't exist in the original Zelda, where players were instead incentivized to battle enemies in order to earn rupees, the in-game currency, making money the reward for combat. Now, progression will be tied more directly to combat itself. Another major innovation brought on, or at least popularized by Dragon Quest, was the way the game's story was told. At the time, most video games didn't really have stories, just a few lines of context in the manual. The first Zelda took things a step further, presenting a lot of narrative and visuals in its instruction booklet. But Dragon Quest handled it differently, introducing NPCs who would share bits and pieces of the story when the player spoke to them. This meant the story was in the game itself, which was a big deal. Because on the Famicom and NES, cartridge memory was so limited that including large amounts of dialogue, along with individual lines for multiple characters, was a real technical challenge. But once again, the first Zelda stood in total contrast to this new approach. In Zelda I, you're completely alone in a hostile world. You have this overwhelming sense of isolation, which actually deepens the immersion. There are no towns, barely any NPCs. It's just you, all by yourself in the middle of a dangerous world. And that's something players really loved. So once again, the development team faced a tough decision. Should they recreate the experience of the first Zelda and ignore the Dragon Quest revolution? or should they shift toward a similar structure? Like with many other things, they chose compromise. The game would again be split into two distinct phases, a top-down view where Link would be alone, facing the dangers of the world, and a side view used for both combat and village exploration. Taking a cue from Dragon Quest, the dev team decided to add villages populated with NPCs who would share information about the world through dialogue. But at Nintendo, they never do things quite like everyone else. Rather than simply placing static NPCs around the world like in Dragon Quest, they chose to create moving NPCs with their own personal routines, doing different things at different times. The team saw this as a big improvement, making the world feel more alive. The problem, though, was technical limitations. They really struggled to make it work. Memory was extremely limited, and that made it difficult to implement custom behavior and varied dialogue for the NPCs. In the end, they had to scale back their animations. Meanwhile, even as this Zelda game was being developed more like a spin-off, Miyamoto was already thinking ahead about a true sequel to the original Zelda, one that would involve the original dev team. For that sequel, he envisioned a better story and a cast of characters: an elf, a wizard, and a fairy. Eventually, the design of that fairy found its way into this new game through a magic spell that lets Link transform into a fairy, allowing him to access otherwise unreachable areas. It was another kind of compromise. Link remains alone on his quest, but through transformation, it's as if he gains a companion, bringing in a new gameplay mechanic and enriching the experience. And during development, Super Mario Bros. 2 was released in Japan, what would later be known internationally as the Lost Levels. And while it was a commercial success, there were some big criticisms. People pointed out how much it resembled the first Super Mario Bros. Even though the gameplay philosophy was quite different when you actually played it, the visual similarities led many players to assume it was the same game, which discouraged some from buying it. That feedback made a big impression on Nintendo. It's what taught them that every sequel needs to bring something visually different to the table. And since they were already deep into development on this Zelda spin-off, it only pushed them further in the direction of making something truly different. Development of the game continued throughout 1986, and during that time there was a huge trend in Japan for very difficult games. Most of the top-selling games in Japan were known for being extremely hard. One of the clearest examples was Super Mario Bros. 2, a game that was punishingly difficult, brutal even, but still considered good for its time, aside from the criticism that it looked too much like the first Mario. It even had a sticker on the cover warning players that the game was hard, which wasn't seen as a downside back then, but actually a selling point. It was the same with Ghosts and Goblins, another title that sold well despite, or maybe because of, how cruelly difficult it was. You could also add Metroid to that list, though its difficulty came more from navigating the world and finding your way than from mechanical execution. Even the original Zelda was a pretty tough game, especially in the final dungeons, yet it was very well received and few people criticized its difficulty. The truth is, games at that time were generally very hard, and for two main reasons. First, there was the arcade legacy. Arcade machines made money from each coin inserted, so developers designed games to be hard in order to keep play sessions short and encourage players to insert more coins. That mindset carried over to home console development. Second, technical limitations. Cartridges and floppy disks had very little storage space, so games didn't have much content. But these games were still technologically advanced for their time and cost a lot to produce and buy. So players expected them to last a while. In fact, part of Zelda 1's success came from that exact formula. Its toughness and long lifespan were strong selling points. So the decision was made. Zelda 2 would be even more difficult than the first, making it a game that would take a really long time to beat. But there was a problem with that, as developers ended up designing the game based on their own skill level and experience, which was skewed. While developing the game, they were constantly playtesting it, which made them incredibly good at it, to the point where they didn't even realize how difficult it had become. As a result, the game ended up with very challenging battles and constantly spawning enemies, which also fit nicely with the new experience point system. One of the challenges Nintendo was facing around this time, just like with Super Mario Bros. 2, was that Shigeru Miyamoto had just become a father. He was deeply committed to his family and didn't want to sacrifice that time, so he wasn't as hands-on with some of these projects, which may explain why certain decisions in Zelda II strayed from his usual direction. After the story in the first Zelda had been so well received, the dev team also wanted to write a new story that was connected to the previous one. But since this new Zelda game wasn't intended to be a direct sequel, that was a little tricky. It seems that Takashi Tezuka, who had helped write the story of the original Zelda, was tasked with creating this new story and tying it into the previous one. Here's what he came up with. Thanks to Link's brave efforts, the Kingdom of Hyrule has been saved, and the Triforce of Power and Wisdom have been recovered. However, Ganon's army of monsters continues to pursue Link, believing that if they kill him and sprinkle his blood on Ganon's remains, they can bring their master back to life. On Link's 16th birthday, a golden triangle appears on the back of his left hand, a symbol that Impa recognizes. She takes him to a sealed door, known only as the door that does not open. When the golden symbol is revealed on Link's hand, the door slowly opens, and behind it lies Princess Zelda in a deep sleep. Impa tells the tale. Long ago, the Prince of Hyrule wished to unite the three pieces of the Triforce to wield their combined power. But the Triforce of Courage was missing. Only Princess Zelda knew its location. Before his death, the King of Hyrule, fearful of his son's reckless nature, told only his daughter Zelda the location of the final Triforce piece. But when the prince demanded the secret, Zelda refused to speak. In desperation, the prince enlisted a magician to threaten her with an eternal sleep unless she revealed the Triforce's location. But she stayed silent, and so she fell under a spell. Overcome with remorse, the prince placed Zelda on an altar behind a sealed door and declared that from that day forward, all royal daughters would bear the name Zelda, so that the tragedy would never be forgotten. After telling this story, Impa gives Link a scroll and 6 crystals. The scroll contains a message from the late king, explaining that the Triforce consists of power, wisdom, and courage, and that only when united do they reveal their full power. The Triforce of Power and Wisdom are within the kingdom, but the Triforce of Courage was hidden, because a misuse of all three could cause a great catastrophe. The final piece is hidden in the Great Palace, deep in Death Valley, but it can only be reached after defeating the 6 guardian statues, each one activated by placing one of the crystals. Once the full Triforce is united, the eternal sleep spell that binds Zelda can finally be lifted, and with that, Link's new quest begins. What's particularly unique about this game is that the developers didn't just write a few lines in the manual to explain the story. They went all out and made it into an illustrated book with multiple pages of narrative, each paired with detailed artwork. And to make sure the illustrations were consistent and well-crafted, they actually used a process similar to how anime was made at the time. As a result, the artwork was surprisingly high quality, especially for something included in a game manual. By the end of 1986, the game was nearly finished, which came as a bit of a surprise. After doing internal playtests, Nintendo felt that the game was very good, and so they made a decision. Instead of treating it as a side project or a spin-off, they would make it a true sequel to the first Zelda. There were 2 main reasons for this. First, the story in this new Zelda game is clearly connected to the events of the first game. And second, they could sense that players were expecting a sequel. That's just how things were back then. Every popular game had a follow-up, and players were used to sequels. So the game was officially titled The Legend of Zelda II, Rinkuno Boken, which roughly translates to The Adventure of Link, which was a surprising name, because the first Zelda game in Japan wasn't even called The Legend of Zelda. Its original title was Zeruda no Densetsu, The Hyrule Fantasy. So this new title marked a big shift. Not only did they drop the Hyrule Fantasy part, but they also put the spotlight directly on Link, the character. And that's strange because in the first game, Link barely existed as a defined character. You'd start the game by giving your character a name. It didn't even have to be Link. Some game journalists later speculated that the change might have been to differentiate the game from other titles using the word fantasy, like Final Fantasy. But that theory doesn't really hold up, because Final Fantasy didn't come out until much later, and there doesn't seem to be any other major game from that time using fantasy in the title either. So to this day, the title change remains a bit of a mystery. It's January 14, 1987, and The Legend of Zelda II, Rinku no Boken, is released in Japan, accompanied by a rather low-key marketing campaign. This time, the focus is placed on the game's story and, more importantly, on the new combat system based around attack and defense mechanics. One surprising detail is that in some of the promotional materials, the game's name is actually changed to Zelda no Densetsu, Part 2, clearly trying to tie it more directly to the first game, even though the gameplay is quite different. Famitsu gives it a 36 out of 40, a huge score at the time, praising it as a long, rich adventure that stands on its own while still building on the legacy of the first game. They highlight the two-phase structure, top-down exploration and side-scrolling segments, and see it as a bold and successful evolution of the Zelda formula. For them, it's an excellent title that rekindles interest in the original just 1 year after its release. It ends up being the second highest-rated game of the year, just behind Dragon Quest II, which was a massive phenomenon in Japan. In fact, these two were the only games that year to score higher than 35 out of 40, a clear indicator of their impact and reception by the press. The game avoids the criticisms aimed at Super Mario Bros. 2, which have been faulted for looking too similar to the original. Instead, fans are thrilled to finally have a true sequel to the original Zelda. It sells very well, becoming one of the best-selling games of the year in Japan, despite that year being packed with hit titles. For many players, Zelda II absolutely lives up to the original, but despite its massive success, there's one criticism that keeps coming back: the difficulty. The game is extremely hard, notoriously so. The game is so hard, Nintendo receives so many calls from players asking for tips. As Sugiyama recalls, "I remember a call we got from a customer back then. He said he simply couldn't beat the final boss. We talked to him and found out he had all the strongest gear in the game, so we had to tell him, at this point, it's just up to your skills," and it seemed like he was playing with his son. But as mentioned earlier, this reputation for high difficulty didn't deter players at all. In fact, it added value. People saw the challenge as a way to get more hours of gameplay out of a title. The only thing that really held back Zelda II's popularity in Japan was the fact that, like the original game, it was released for the Famicom Disk System, an add-on that wasn't as widespread as the standard cartridge format. This made the game less accessible compared to titles like Dragon Quest, which came out on cartridge. Even so, it became a huge commercial success, opening the door for a potential international release. Just like the first Zelda, the game was converted from floppy disk to cartridge, this time in a golden cartridge that included a save battery. A groundbreaking technology at the time, which had already surprised players with the first Zelda. This means Zelda II was once again on the cutting edge with its save battery, but that also made it pricier than most other games. The title was changed by Nintendo of America to Zelda II: The Adventure of Link, but then disaster struck. In the summer of 1986, the US government was furious because the American electronics component industry was struggling. The main reason? Japan. Following the boom in video games there, Japan was manufacturing and selling components of better quality and at lower prices than the Americans. As a result, everyone preferred to buy Japanese components, so the US government signed an agreement with Japan to limit component imports. But it completely backfired. Instead of slowing Japanese growth, prices skyrocketed due to high demand and lower supply. Japanese companies sold their components at even higher prices, increasing their profit margins. This situation caused a massive shortage of components in the video game industry, severely limiting cartridge production. In practical terms, this meant games were more expensive outside of Japan, and the shortage significantly delayed the release of Japanese games in other regions. Zelda II kept getting pushed back, frustrating American and European fans who had been hearing about it and seeing screenshots for months. And it wasn't the only game affected. This situation took a long time to stabilize. Eventually, Zelda II: The Adventure of Link was released in the US at the end of 1988, nearly 2 years after its Japanese launch. That was extremely late, even for that time. And it was even worse for Europe, where the game arrived in 89 and 90, 3 years after its Japanese release. 3 years is a long time, Games had evolved a lot by then. And yet it was a massive hit internationally too. For journalists, the long-awaited release was triumphant. The magazine Play described it as an excellent game combining many different ideas into one, making it a unique experience. Ace called it deeply immersive. You just can't stop playing once you start. They praised the game's save system and described it as a must-play, one of the 5 best games on the console, giving it a score of 9 out of 10. They called Zelda I an undisputed action-adventure masterpiece, impossible to surpass, but said Adventure of Link came very close thanks to its many innovations, perfectly balanced adventure and action elements, rich gameplay, and overall excellence. And even though journalists pointed out the game's difficulty again, it wasn't considered a flaw. Much later, EGM would include it in their top 100 games of all time, calling it a masterpiece, though slightly less refined than other Zelda titles. As for the public, they embraced it wholeheartedly. Zelda II sold incredibly well, becoming one of the best-selling NES games, with nearly 5 million copies sold in total. That's huge, even if it fell slightly short of the first game's numbers. Together, Zelda I and Zelda II, alongside Super Mario Bros. 3, were largely responsible for the NES's success in Europe, where it initially struggled against fierce competition from Sega, which had entered the European market much earlier. Zelda I and II really helped turn the tide, paving the way for Super Mario Bros. 3 to explode in popularity. So how did a game that's mostly forgotten today, and even regularly criticized as being the worst Zelda made by Nintendo, manage to receive such unanimous praise worldwide at the time, even following in the footsteps of a legendary first entry? Why does Miyamoto himself consider it the least interesting game he worked on, even though it shocked and impressed when it came out? What makes Zelda II so different from the rest of the series, and why hasn't it stood the test of time as well as Zelda I, despite releasing earlier? And finally, what kind of legacy did Zelda II leave behind? Or for the Zelda series and for video games as a whole? Let's dive into all of that right now with a quick analysis of this one-of-a-kind game. After naming our character, we're immediately dropped in front of the sleeping Princess Zelda, right where the story in the booklet leaves off. And already we notice the biggest change in the game. It starts in a side-scrolling view, completely different from the top-down perspective of the first Zelda. What's clever is that we're placed in a large open space, giving us time to get used to this new perspective. It lets players learn Link's new movements, jumping, moving around, sword attacks. Once we leave the palace, the game suddenly shifts to a top-down view, much closer to what we saw in the first Zelda. And as soon as we start moving a bit, enemies appear and attack us, and the game automatically switches back to side view for combat. It quickly becomes clear that the game is divided into 2 phases, a top-down exploration phase and a side-scrolling action phase. And again, this is smart design. The first enemies we face are ground-based, which naturally make us crouch and attack low. That's when we discover that Link can strike downward, and on top of that, just like in the first Zelda, if our health is full, the sword shoots out a projectile. And because these enemies are aggressive, we also find out that our shield can block attacks and projectiles, even while we're in the middle of an attack. Something that's different from the first game, where the shield only worked when you stood still. We also discover that there are different types of enemies that can attack while we're moving in the top-down view. Some look more intimidating than others. We learn we can avoid some of them, and that some enemies give experience points while others don't, which encourages the player to avoid certain fights instead of charging into all of them. That idea becomes crucial as the game goes on. The early part of the game seems focused on action, but exploration is just as important. For example, we find a forest tile surrounded by grass. It naturally piques our curiosity. We step into it, and we're instantly rewarded with experience points. That sends a message right away. Exploration matters, and it will always be rewarded. Just like in the first Zelda. And to really spark our curiosity, the game introduces mysterious elements right from the start, like dark caves hiding enemies in the shadows, making them impossible to explore at first. But the most symbolic part of the game's beginning is that the player starts with a sword and a shield. Remember in the video of the first Zelda, I explained how you begin that adventure with nothing. You have to go find the sword, fight monsters to earn rupees, then buy a shield yourself. The game was teaching you that you'd have to rely on your own efforts, and that exploration was the core of the experience. Here, by giving us the sword and shield right from the start, the game is clearly showing us that action is going to take the lead this time, and we'll see exactly how in the upcoming combat and leveling system. The combat system in this game is incredibly refined. It might seem standard to us today, but for the time it was surprisingly deep. First of all, Link is very responsive. Whether it's for attacks or movement, there's a wide variety of attacks. You've got strikes while jumping, low attacks, and mid-air hits aimed at enemies' heads. You can even shoot fireballs using a spell we'll talk about later. And throughout the game, you actually learn new moves, like a downward stab during a jump, which is super useful, and another that lets you strike enemies above you. The combat is fast-paced and satisfying, and way deeper than in the first Zelda. But where the system really shines is in its incredible variety of enemies, each with its own behaviors and characteristics. You've got enemies that can only be hit on the ground, enemies that strike from a distance with spears, some that throw axes straight at you, others that charge in quickly from the bottom of the screen, forcing you to manage your positioning and speed. There are flying enemies all over the place that you have to hit with upward attacks. Others use special weapons like flails, which can't be blocked with your shield. Some pop up from the ground, some are only vulnerable to specific attacks or body parts. It's really diverse, and the constant introduction of new enemy types keeps combat feeling fresh and prevents repetition, even though you're fighting all the time. And all those enemies I just listed are only the ones you find outside in the overworld. That's not even half of the enemies in the game, because there are even more waiting in the dungeons. And inside the dungeons, the enemies get even more interesting. They make for more technical and challenging fights. There are Stalfos you can only hit low, but they can still hit you head-on. There are golems with tons of health that don't defend at all. They just soak up damage and hit back hard. Then you've got the knights, who block most of your attacks and are only vulnerable at specific moments, or to the head, so you have to jump to strike them, which leaves you more exposed. There are Gumas, who throw arcing projectiles. You've got bouncing ball-like enemies that ricochet off walls and change speed. There are Faka, which are super fast, leaping all over the screen. Some magicians that are completely immune to your sword, and you have to reflect their magic to beat them. And there's even more than that, and many of them come in color variations, with stronger versions being harder to defeat. And on top of all that, there are the bosses, each with totally different behaviors from regular enemies. There's a knight whose helmet you have to knock off by hitting him in the head, and he shoots fireballs. Another charges at you in a kind of chariot with a lance, and you need to jump and hit him at the perfect moment. There's a dragon rising from lava, spitting fire until you defeat it. And of course, the final battle against Dark Link, who mirrors your every move. The fights stay fun because you're constantly facing new enemies. And even when you're not, you're seeing familiar enemies used in new ways or situations, which keeps things feeling fresh. It's honestly incredible. This game came out in 1987 on a simple NES, yet the enemy variety alone creates so many different scenarios and really pushes the combat system to a level of excellence. It might seem simple at first glance, but it's so well designed, and that massive enemy roster adds so much depth and variety that the combat system ends up feeling constantly renewed. And it's really important because the player will need to fight to grab experience points in order to level up and improve his statistics. And you're really going to need those rewards and level ups, because Zelda II is an incredibly difficult game, super hard in fact. It's known for its brutal difficulty, and that reputation is well deserved. It's tough because the enemies are aggressive. Tough because even a single hit during a platforming section can send you to your death. Tough because you often have to deal with multiple enemies at once, and it's hard to manage them all. Tough because it's really hard to heal in this game. Tough because battles can either be forced on you just by stepping on certain tiles on the map or triggered by enemies chasing you down, so you never get a break, never get a moment to breathe, never know what's coming before it jumps at you. And of course, whenever you get a game over, you're sent all the way back to the starting palace and have to redo the entire route to get back to where you were. And on the way back, you're getting attacked again. It's brutal. The farther you are from the starting zone, the stronger and more aggressive the enemies become. Some even drain your experience points when they hit you. Bosses from earlier dungeons become mini-bosses in later ones, and the dungeons are packed with enemies. And yet, this high difficulty isn't really a flaw because the game is built around it. It rarely feels unfair when you die. It's usually because you made a mistake, took a hit you could have avoided, so you feel like it's your fault, not the game's. And the game never forces you to grind for experience just to get past a boss or enemy. The best proof that the game was designed with this difficulty in mind is the fact that you get multiple lives. That's surprising in a Zelda game. It's more common in platformers like Mario. So why include it here? Because it lets the game be hard without being unfair. If you die during a tricky platforming section because you were hit at the wrong time, you get to try again. If you're killed by enemies you hadn't seen before, you get another shot. Sometimes it's even useful to die just to refill your health and magic. It's an interesting addition that opens up new possibilities for a Zelda game, and it makes the game's brutal difficulty just a little more bearable, especially since you can actually find extra lives scattered throughout the world. But again, even though being sent back to the beginning after every game over seems cruel, the whole game is designed around that idea. The world is cleverly built. Hyrule Palace, the place you return to after a game over, is centrally located, close to most of the places you need to visit. That makes being sent back a little less frustrating. The fights you have to go through on the way back can help you gain extra experience, making you better prepared the next time around. And as you progress through the game, you collect items that open up the world even more, letting you return to where you died much faster. On top of that, during the trip back, you often find new areas that you couldn't explore the first time you passed by. For example, early in the game, you'll come across dark caves that are impossible to explore because you can't see anything. But later, you get the candle that lets you light them up. And since you get sent back near these caves after a game over, it's natural to return to them, even if you didn't think about it at the time. So this isn't just a frustrating mechanic added to artificially extend the game's length. It's a core part of the gameplay. And the ultimate proof that this is an actual game mechanic, not a random punishment, is that, conveniently, once you reach the final dungeon, if you lose all your lives and get a game over, you don't go back to the beginning anymore. Instead, you're sent back to the start of the final dungeon. That's because by the time you've reached this point, the mechanic of returning to the beginning, meant to push you to level up and explore more, no longer makes sense. That level of attention to detail shows how deliberate the game's design is. Still, even though the game is clearly built around this harsh difficulty, there's one moment where things go too far, where it just becomes too much, too absurd, too unfair, and too frustrating. Death Mountain. And it truly lives up to its name. It's a series of caves and tunnels filled with very strong enemies, placed in areas where you often can't even jump to dodge projectiles. You're forced to deal with new enemy types you haven't encountered before, so there's no way to heal. It's long, it's tedious, and worst of all, it's the path to reach the second dungeon. That's way too early in the game, considering the player likely hasn't had enough time to build up strength or skills yet. It can be really discouraging. That said, for me, that was the only moment where the difficulty felt unjust. The rest of the time, I found the game to be merciless, but not unfair. And if the difficulty of the action sequences has taken up so much space, it's because exploration has become much less important. Remember, in the first Zelda, exploration was the heart of the game. Here, it's still an important aspect, but a lot less so. And you can notice it right from the beginning by the fact that there's no more radar. In the original Zelda, the radar was super important because the world was huge, and it helped you keep track of where you were. Here, the world is still large, but you spend less time wandering, and especially in the overworld, the camera is zoomed way out, so you see a huge portion of the map at once. That makes it much easier to spot key locations, and so, in the end, you don't explore all that much. On the one hand, this gives the game more momentum, since you're constantly progressing and the adventure keeps moving forward without having to search for hours. But on the other hand, it takes away from the gratifying feeling of wandering through a dangerous world and making discoveries on your own, because here, a lot of things are clearly indicated. Unlike in Zelda I, where you could go almost anywhere right from the start, here the world is locked off by obstacles that you can only bypass later, using items you collect as the adventure goes on. For example, early on there's a giant boulder blocking your path, which you'll be able to destroy later with the hammer. These obstacles that block parts of the map serve to guide the player gradually, preventing them from getting lost, whereas getting lost was kind of the whole point of the first game. It's really in the exploration element that you see this new design direction with a more linear progression, and so the focus shifts more toward action. There are even platforming sections now to add even more variety to the action-heavy gameplay. But what's smart is that exploration isn't completely abandoned. There are still plenty of optional places to visit, like caves that always reward the player, whether with extra heart containers, increased magic, or even additional lives. And what's clever is that little by little, the game starts to ask more from the player in terms of exploration. At first, you're not required to explore at all, but if you do, you're rewarded. Then gradually, exploration becomes more and more important, until you're eventually required to find a hidden village, or a dungeon in the middle of the water, or even an entire labyrinth to explore. It's a smart way to ease the player into it and slowly build up their curiosity, encouraging them to really engage with the world and make it their own. That said, exploration is a lot less enjoyable than in the previous game, mostly because there is less variety, fewer distinct environments, and the camera is so far from Link that the environments look pretty crude, which makes them less interesting to explore. Plus, there are some really annoying zones, like swamps where you move painfully slow, which means you get attacked over and over again by enemies you can't avoid. Still, exploration is crucial, especially to find new and extremely important places, the villages. Zelda II is the first game in the series to introduce towns with NPCs, safe zones where you can heal and take a breather. Once again, this is the total opposite of the first Zelda, which had no real NPCs aside from merchants or a few rare characters who gave cryptic hints. In Zelda I, you were always completely alone in a hostile world, and that feeling of isolation, being lost, abandoned, was a huge part of what made the immersion so powerful. It was arguably the game's strongest point. The hero's journey mirrored the player's own experience, lost, vulnerable, surrounded by danger, and all of that is gone here. But then, why did they make this choice? Well, because having villages actually adds a lot of depth and value to the game. For one, it makes the world of Hyrule feel much more believable, and a lot of effort went into that. The NPCs have dialogue that's often relevant and interesting, helping to ground the world in a more relatable way. Some of them even seem to follow a kind of schedule, walking in and out of their homes, wandering around town. It gives the world a sense of life. Most importantly, the NPCs actively try to help the hero in his quest. As I mentioned, they heal you, but they also give you tons of clues and useful information that are crucial for progressing. There are even knights who teach you new combat techniques, and wise elders who teach you spells to aid your journey. All of this gives your quest real meaning. You start to care about this world and want to protect these people who are constantly helping you without ever asking for anything in return. There's no money or shops in Zelda II. People help you for free, or in exchange for very simple tasks like fetching some water from nearby. That again adds to the credibility of the world. On top of that, every village feels distinct in shape, size, and even color. And the further you get into the game, the less peaceful these towns become. Some have graves, others have inhabitants who turn into enemies, and eventually you find a fully abandoned village crawling with monsters. The world building goes even further when you later find the refugees from that abandoned town hiding in a secret village in the forest, and you realize they had to flee and go into hiding. It makes total sense narratively, especially considering that the closer a village is to the final dungeon, the more likely it is to have been attacked. And that final village was violently attacked, of course, because that's where you find the last mage, the one who teaches you the thunder spell, which is absolutely required to beat the final boss. It ties everything together thematically and logically, and adds weight to the journey's final moments. And those spells are going to be extremely useful in the dungeons, because that's where the game is at its cruelest. These dungeons are labyrinths, where you need to find keys to open paths, packed with all sorts of enemies to fight. And you might think, well, that's just like Zelda 1. But the huge difference is that here, the dungeons are way bigger and more maze-like. And on top of that, there's no map and no compass to help you navigate. That makes going through them pretty tough because bosses can literally be anywhere. Early on, they tend to be at the end of a straightforward path, but the further you get, the less predictable it becomes. The boss of the 5th dungeon, for example, is right in the middle, not tucked away in the bottom right like you might expect. These dungeons really make you feel like you're completely alone against the world. Alone against hundreds of enemies, with crumbling bridges, elevators to take, stronger bosses, and ceilings that fall on you as you pass. They're full-on moments of tension and pressure, and they condense everything the game throws at you all at once. Platforming, combat, exploration, and constant discovery. That said, sometimes the mechanics go a bit too far. In the 4th dungeon, for instance, there's a moment where you have to fall into a pit to progress. It's not totally unreasonable because in Zelda II, falling into a pit doesn't automatically mean death. You only die if you fall into lava, water, or some other clearly dangerous element. So it's not illogical to think you might need to drop down at some point, especially since the enemies in that room try to push you into the pit. Still, it feels a bit counterintuitive, especially for players coming from Super Mario Bros., where falling always means losing a life. And it gets worse in the 5th dungeon. At one point, you literally have to walk through a wall to continue, and that's really pushing it. Sure, that kind of trick existed in the first Zelda, in a dungeon with the same color palette even, but that was in a game where you had a map that hinted there was a room below. Plus, that trick was mostly part of the second quest, meant for experienced players. Here, there's no clue at all. Worse still, this room has an enemy in it, so once you've beaten it, there is no reason to think you haven't cleared it entirely, you just move on. In the 6th dungeon, it gets downright cruel. There are invisible floor traps, literal holes you can't see until you fall into them. You have no choice but to fall in at least once to even know they're there. And after you've gone all the way around to get back to that room, you then have to avoid an invisible hole that you still can't actually see. That's just brutal. Overall, the dungeons are pretty solid and even impressive in size for a game from that era. Just look at the size of this dungeon. We're talking about an NES game from 1987, and it's massive. So massive that magazines at the time needed multiple pages just to print out a complete map. That said, they still carry over one of the annoying issues from Zelda 1. Some dungeons have essential quest items that you need in order to progress, but the game doesn't check to make sure you've actually picked them up before letting you finish the dungeon. And since the dungeons are huge, it's entirely possible to miss one of those items and have to go all the way back in later. Thankfully, the game does indicate when you fully completed a dungeon. Once you've done everything important, it collapses into a rock and you can't enter it again. So if that hasn't happened, it's a clear sign that you missed something and should go back. What's a bit disappointing is that those quest items themselves are often less exciting than in the first game. Some are directly recycled, like the raft, for example, but most of them can't even be used directly. In Zelda 1, finding the bow in a dungeon meant you could now take out enemies from a distance, even outside the dungeon. But here, that's not the case. These items just sit in your inventory and only work in very specific moments, like the hammer, which is only used to break a huge rock, but can't be used in combat, which is a shame. Same with the candle. It lights up caves automatically, but in Zelda 1, you had to light them yourself, and you could even use the flame against enemies. That's not possible here, so the items feel more like passive tools than meaningful upgrades, which is a bit of a letdown, especially considering how much effort it takes to get them in the first place. These dungeons, like many other elements, were slightly adjusted in the international versions of the game because the international version of Zelda II benefited from numerous improvements compared to the original Japanese release, thanks to the 2-year gap between their launches. More varied sprites and colors, added animations, reworked bosses, and visually more polished elements. However, there were some notable losses, such as specific animations from the Famicom Disk System and cultural references, like one to Dragon Quest, that were removed during localization, or the music of the game that sounds more aggressive in the international release because of the conversion from the Famicom Disk System, which had a better sound quality. Rare for the time, the European version was even optimized to run at the correct speed despite the constraints of the PAL format. So, Zelda II is a game full of strengths, and yet Miyamoto himself has described it as the game he regrets the most. Not because it's a bad game, he was clear on that, but because he felt they could have done more with Zelda II. He summed it up perfectly with this quote: "When we design a game, we usually start with a plan of what we want to make, but during development, the game evolves and becomes something different. Unfortunately, with Zelda II, what we ended up with was exactly what we had defined in the initial plan." Miyamoto even stated in an interview that, for Nintendo, Zelda II is kind of a spin-off, and that the real Zelda II is a link to the past, which, to be fair, takes a lot from Zelda I and feels more like a direct sequel than the outlier that is Adventure of Link. But in the end, Miyamoto has made so many extraordinary games that calling Zelda II his biggest regret says way more about the quality of his portfolio than about the game itself. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Zelda II: The Adventure of Link is a good game. It's a well-designed title with smart choices that make its structure coherent. That bold decision to include a life system, for example, ends up making sense considering the platforming and the game's high difficulty. The move to downplay exploration in favor of action and combat was risky, but it serves a purpose, and the huge variety of enemies, each with different behavior, fits perfectly into that action-first approach. And to give players a reason to push through the frustration and difficulty, Nintendo made the world really believable. A world filled with villages and NPCs who genuinely want to help the hero. A world where those same villages are under attack to keep them from doing so. A world where you really feel like the last hope, and that makes you want to save it. Zelda II is often viewed as the black sheep of the series, the bad Zelda, but that's so far from the truth. Almost every strength and weakness the game has stems from a desire to do something different than Zelda I, to avoid just rehashing what came before, and that's admirable, especially when the final result is as solid as this. And what's really amazing is that for a game from that era, the controls are outstanding. That's something we tend to take for granted, but so many games from that time had clunky jumping, sluggish movement, awkward combat. Here, Link controls beautifully, more responsive and agile than in the first game. The real issue with Zelda II is that it sits between two absolute titans, the groundbreaking Zelda I and the monumental Zelda III. So naturally, Zelda II ends up looking a bit more modest in comparison. But that's an unfair bias. When you judge a video game as a work of art, or at least a piece of culture, you need to put it back into its historical and technological context. And when you do that, most of the criticism Zelda II receives lose their weight. Its brutal difficulty, for instance, made sense at a time when hard games were the norm. In the end, Zelda II is a good game trapped inside a legendary franchise. But here's the thing, that franchise wouldn't have become legendary without Zelda II. Its legacy is anything but minor. It's the first game to introduce the 3-part Triforce, and the idea that combining them unlocks its full power, because in Zelda I, there were only 2 pieces. Zelda II introduced the Triforce of Courage, which has been a staple ever since. It also introduced names like Rauru, Ruto, Saria, Naburu, and Darunia. Names of the towns in this game that would later become the names of sages and characters in Ocarina of Time. It brought in Dark Link, who became a recurring character. It introduced magic, which would be reused in many future titles, some with the idea of NPCs with daily routines. But maybe its biggest impact lies in how it shaped combat in the 3D Zelda games. even though its specific system was shelved afterward. Yoshiaki Koizumi explained that it laid the foundation for Ocarina of Time's 3D combat, proof of just how good the combat system is in this game. And the legacy of Zelda II goes beyond the Zelda series. Link's attacks in Smash Bros. Are directly based on this game. Tons of Japanese games from that era were influenced by it. Moon Crystal, the Battle of Olympus, Faxanadu, even the creator of Ninja Gaiden cited it as a direct inspiration. And even today, you can see its influence in modern games. Shovel Knight has moments that feel just like it. And Phoenotopia openly markets itself as a tribute to Zelda II. Zelda II didn't stay locked to the NES. It was re-released on GameCube in the Wind Waker Collector's Disc. It showed up again on Game Boy Advance as part of the classic NES series for the Famicom's 20th anniversary. It was on Virtual Console for both Wii and 3DS, where it caught new attention. And it's even on the NES Mini, which led to many journalists replaying the game over 20 years later and reviewing it with fresh eyes. Outlets like IGN, 1UP, and Kotaku described it as a surprisingly excellent game, full of clever mechanics that never appeared in the series again. So yes, Zelda II has often been dismissed or criticized, but it's a remarkable game that left behind a massive legacy, both in its own franchise and in the gaming world as a whole. And for all of those reasons, it truly deserves to be remembered. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps keep this channel alive, especially since we don't do any brand deals here. See you very soon for another video. Take care.